Okay, hi, that's better. I'm going to speak to you about a few key things to do with planning. My first part of the presentation is going to be on strategic waste management, strategic planning in terms of waste management and what the EPA is doing in that area. And in particular, we're going to look at population and residential trends. And the second part, I'm going to talk about the challenges that councils face in terms of when waste management isn't planned upfront, and what councils can do to achieve better waste management outcomes in new builds. So looking at the population and housing growth, we've heard quite a bit today that New South Wales population is growing. It's expected to increase to 9.9 million by 2036, and the Sydney metropolitan area alone are expected a growth of from the current about 4.6 million through to about 6.4 million by 2036. To house that number of increase in people, we're expected to see an increase in housing dwellings of 725,000 properties to be built between 2016 and 2036. And this growth in housing will predominantly be in higher density and multi-unit dwellings, which I'll call MUDs from now on. Just to illustrate that point, this graph demonstrates the number of completed dwellings between November 15 and November 2016. The bar graph, the yellow bar, represents the number of multi-unit dwellings completed, and the green line represents the number of single dwellings completed. And if we just have a look at one council there, Rockdale Council, which is now Bayside Council, in that 12-month period alone, it had 1,600 multi-unit dwellings completed against 18 single houses. And in the other extreme there, if you look at the number of single houses completed for Camden, Blacktown and the Hillshire in our western part of Sydney, you're looking at spikes that are quite high there in terms of the number of single houses, and that's a result from the greenfield sites and the release of new land, which we've already talked about. Just to give you some more idea where the government's going in terms of its vision for Sydney, this image is taken from a document called Towards Our Greater Sydney 2056, which is a strategic planning document recently released by the Greater Sydney Commission. And it's giving a vision of Sydney growing into three distinct cities. A city to the east, a city in the centre called Central City, bounded by the Greater Parramatta area, and a city to the west called the Western City around the Western Sydney Airport. This is the vision that was just recently released, and as you can see, it will be quite transformational for the type of growth that they have for Sydney going forward. So in terms of some more strategic planning ideas, I've mentioned the Greater Sydney Commission. For those of you who are not familiar with the Greater Sydney Commission, they were recently established, it was late 2015. They are a government funded body, but an independent body. And they recently released some documents called district plans, which you may have heard of recently. They carved up Sydney into 6 regions, and each of those regions has its own commissioner. And each of those commissioners have, as I said, recently released a draft district plan. So in terms of the EPA, we've been talking to the Greater Sydney Commission since they were established in ensuring that waste and resource recovery is mentioned in these district plans. We provided background information to the Environment Commissioner, and we made sure that they understood the key issues affecting planning across Sydney, and to help tell the story to the Commission about what the issues are. So we were instrumental in making sure that district plans did get a waste mention. So the district plans have now been finalised in terms of the draft. The exhibition period closed at the end of March, and they're looking to finalise those plans at the end of this year. Councils will be required to consider the district plans in planning for new developments and DA proposals going forward. So in terms of what the EPA, what we try to convey, and some of the message we tried to convey to the Greater Sydney Commission, what we did see come out in the district plans are some key points. This was mentioned earlier today, the fact that they do acknowledge that there is a need for additional waste and recycling facilities going forward to meet the demand in our population growth and, of course, the waste it will generate. So there was, that came through the district plans. There was also an acknowledgement around basically when local councils are making planning decisions, they need to consider these things. Protecting existing waste management facilities from encroachment by sensitive development. We really did impress on them that we don't want to see transfer stations or any other waste facility rezoned to residential. They need to use appropriate land use zones to minimise potential conflict of existing waste facilities. And they need to consider design measures such as fully enclosing waste facilities, and that way you don't have dust and odour and noise issues encroaching on the nearby communities. We also gave the Greater Sydney Commission our local government waste and resource recovery data so that they can map the information for the first time in a sort of a visual way. And this is something that they've got on their website. It's a dashboard, which is quite innovative, and I think it's a good way for them to tell the story of the different environmental concerns. Waste is just one of them. They've got maps of CO2, land use, air pollution and things like that. So it's quite a good tool to have a look at. So what else is the EPA doing in terms of strategic planning and raising the issue of waste management? We do submissions to key documents. So when things like SEPs come up, the EPA does do submissions to those. Of course, we did the submission to the Greater District Plans. We did the submission to the missing middle document that was mentioned earlier. And we also do submissions for any state significant residential developments. So we do try and make sure that waste is considered and pushed through those documents. The two documents that I've got featured up here are two existing EPA documents, the Waste Not DCP template and the Better Practice Guide for Waste Management and Multi-Unit Dwellings. Both those documents have been around since 2008, and I'm currently updating those documents. They are guidance documents. We've already talked about the role of DCPs and where they sit, but these documents do provide some good ideas and examples of how to ensure that waste management is planned for up in the early planning stages, and so we can get some good outcomes in new builds. So I would suggest that in the interim, do go to our website and have a look at these existing documents. Although they're old, there's still some good ideas in them and you can build on those, but we will be releasing the new documents when we get them updated. So just moving on to some of the challenges that councils face when waste management isn't considered up front. This is just a quick glimpse of the sorts of housing that we're seeing more and more of. We've got row houses where you've got houses with common walls in the middle there, between each property, We're seeing more and more townhouse complexes. We're seeing more and more of the one at the bottom, which is a manor house. That's a new term for some, I'd imagine, and the manor house can have up to 5 or 6 sort of families living in it. So this is the missing middle that Mark mentioned before. These more and more of this sort of low-rise, medium density housing. In terms of high-rise, we've mentioned there's a lot more high-rise going up, and we're seeing more precinct development. So entire sites just being, basically brownfield sites being turned into residential complexes like the one on the left there, which is Walleye Creek, up to 1,000 units being built in staged development. And of course, you've got your greenfield sites, which themselves need to be properly planned for in order to get good waste management outcomes. So just quickly looking at some of the challenges that the councils face operationally. Each of those property types have their own challenges, and they do all need to have their own planning thought through up front. This is just a classic example where you've got either a row house or a townhouse development, and the proponent wants to have the waste collection in the rear lane. Things to think about: is the rear lane wide enough to get a council truck down there? What happens when there's a parked car in the rear lane? Where are the residents putting their bins? Are they on top of driveways and just sitting in the lane, like in this case? Is the road strong enough to carry the weight of a heavy ridge vehicle? Is it a private road? That's also can be an issue. So that's just one example. I'm just going to flick over this one, sorry, because I'm going to be running out of time. But this is a good example here of in residential flat buildings. We talked about getting good outcomes in the residential flat building space, making sure that bin rooms are large enough. I mean, we all know that the proponents have to build a bin room, but if they don't do the calculations right in terms of the amount of waste that's being generated for that building, then you just get small bin rooms and inability for the residents to actually recycle properly, and just very poor examples of bin rooms not being taken care of. And councils do sometimes have to go back in there and go back and service mud buildings on a 2 or 3 week basis because the bin rooms were just too small. This is another classic example of on-site versus curbside collection. We're still seeing waste collections occurring at curb, where the better outcome would be for it to be on site. And in this case, classic issues here are the council truck having to stop, the driver having to get out and collect the bins and put them back on the curb, causing traffic congestion while that's occurring. You've got the issues of amenity, just the way it looks for the street, pedestrian access issues, even hazards for the vehicles trying to peer out and look out across the street to try across the street. So, this is a situation that we do think that it's not, the way to go, and planning up front would see those bins off the street. In terms of also with residential flat buildings, other challenges are illegal dumping is often a big occurrence around these buildings, particularly with the high turnaround of residents in MUDs. Technology and equipment. There's a whole range of equipment that can go into medium and high-rise buildings. You've got chute systems, you've got compactors, you could use dehydrators. All that equipment requires either the design team or the planners, the architects to actually know the pros and cons of those equipment, the capacities of that equipment, what equipment's best used in different height buildings, whether to put dual chutes in or one straight waste chute. That's a lot of information to be for those professions to have to think about. So it's all about educating a whole range of different stakeholders in what would work best. And the Better Practice Guide that we're currently updating does cover all of those issues and does talk about pros and cons. So it's still a good resource to go and have a look at. So what does better practice look like? So from all of my involvement in this topic area over the last 2 years, I have come across councils that are doing some fantastic things, but just to give you an idea of some of what better practice does look like, I've got a photo there of a vacuum system. Well, they can be really high-tech solutions like a vacuum system, which I think is a good thing to have in. We mentioned like the precinct developments, where 1,000 units is a good threshold to start looking at vacuum systems and getting those bins off the streets and getting a bit more smarter with the way we collect waste. But it can be a very simple design, basic design idea, such as the bottom left photo there, taken from Camden Council, where it was a back lane waste collection service and the council put in some bin pads, which designate exactly where the resident puts their bins. It's not in the driveway, it's not on the road, the road was built to the right dimensions, and that's a good, very simple design outcome because the waste was planned up front. Then we've also got some images there of going forward in terms of other waste materials that can be collected from multi-unit dwelling. We can't just continue just to focus on a yellow top bin. Some of these buildings, are housing hundreds of people. It's a good opportunity to recover other materials. Some good examples here, we've got polystyrene, we've got cardboard, we've got e-waste being collected. This bottom photo on the bottom right has a clothing bin in that photo. That's in the basement of a building in the city. So yeah, we need to look for opportunities, and this is about making space available at the planning stage for those particular bins. It's not just about the wheelie bins, the recycling bins, the garbage bins. It's also going that bit further and thinking about where else within the building can we have little mini recycling stations like that. So some of the key findings that I have from my experience in this area, I think it's really critical that council waste teams do go along to pre-DA meetings with proponents, particularly for the large complex developments. And I know that many councils, particularly in Western Sydney, are just getting DAs of just a massive number of houses in that one hit. And having the waste person there to start discussing with the proponents the waste operational concerns right from day one gets that planning up front. Permitting on-site collections wherever possible. Look, this is something that council, I guess, has to think about in terms of going forward if they have to change their policies, or it's a good time to think about it is when they're changing their waste collection contract and when the contracts come up, to put their foot down and say this is how it's going to be, and to get some good outcomes there. We've mentioned encouraging the use of space for problem waste and other materials, polystyrene, cardboard. I think that's good practice, and that will be spoken in that the guide that I'm updating. The last point here is about waste management plans. As many of you know, development control plans require applicants to put in a waste management plan. I have seen some of these waste management plans, and many of the officers here have expressed to me the quality of those waste management plans are sometimes poor, and so we would advocate that really waste consultants or people with experience in waste auditing and understand the complexities of council operations should be writing those waste management plans so that council officers do not spend time laboriously looking over poorly written waste management plans and wasting their time holding up the DA for the proponent. So we really need to see how we can address this issue of getting this issue of professionalised. I mean, you wouldn't see an ecology plan being written by someone who enjoys, going out to the bush for a bushwalk. They're done by professionals, and the approving authority wouldn't accept anything less than that. What can councils do to achieve better outcomes in new builds? Keep your, I know you keep your DCPs up to date. I mean, I know that's a political process, but when you do update your DCPs, making sure that the waste section is kept up to date. Build good relationships between the planning and the waste teams. If there's a good relationship between the planning team and the waste team, those DAs can be flicked to the waste team. Any conditions of consent or concerns can be raised, and the planning team will take those on board and take them on board with goodwill and try and push to get those changes in there. A good idea is to develop some guidance documents so that to give to proponents, and that could just be to cover things like the sort of trucks you use, the sort of policies you have around waste management. Build flexibility into your waste contracts to ensure that difficult buildings can be serviced, and raising the profile of waste management with your senior managers and councillors is important too, because when they go into a meeting to approve a DA, you need someone in there fighting for your waste conditions or for your position on waste. So just to finish up now, what is the EPA doing to help councils manage waste in MUDs? We do acknowledge that our population is growing into MUDs, and we need to be looking at our programs in terms of focusing on that particular group of people. So the organics team have currently got the organics grant out, and it's got a stream in there about looking for councils to trial collections of organics in MUDs. The community recycling team will be looking into a future program around how we can collect problem waste from MUDs. And the illegal dumping team are looking at strategies and future programs around reducing illegal dumping in urban areas. And that's it for me.